I'm here today to talk about a part of Civil War history that has not gotten as much attention as some other aspects of the Civil War, and that is emancipation, the destruction of slavery, and the liberation of nearly 4 million people from slavery. Now, when I say not as much attention, I don't mean no attention. In fact, there's one part of emancipation's history that I think is well known, and that's the history of the Emancipation Proclamation, pictured here in its original handwritten manuscript form. The Proclamation, of course, is one of the great documents of American history. It's one that embodies what we as Americans think we are and what we believe in. It embodies our ideals, and we pay tribute to it every year. I was just, before I came up to Philadelphia, I was in Washington, I'll stand still, and went to the National Archives and saw a facsimile of it just this week. And I know it's just a couple days of the year the Archives allows the proclamation actually to be seen. And a lot of people have had a lot to say about the proclamation over the years, including historians like me. There are some who see it as the great triumph of Abraham Lincoln, the moment when he became the quote-unquote great emancipator. There are others, though, over the years that have been a little less sanguine. Some who read the proclamation and they don't see any of the sort of stirring prose for which Lincoln is known. If you read it, it's not a Gettysburg Address. It's very much a very direct military order. In fact, one historian, Richard Hofstadter, who was writing much earlier in the 20th century, he referred to the proclamation as having, quote, the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. So, not a great assessment. There are other historians who sort of wonder, to what extent was Lincoln really, in principle, committed to emancipation, or to what extent was this a pragmatic attempt to win the war? So those are some of the things that historians have said over time. But I want to turn today to the people who were living in the 1860s, who lived at the time of emancipation. What were they thinking? What were they saying about this proclamation? Especially those people who stood to gain the most from it, who would be freed by it. What did they have to say? So I thought I'd begin by taking us back to the moment when the proclamation took effect, which was January 1st, 1863. And here are what some sympathetic Union men who were in the South, what they observed in the reactions of enslaved people to the proclamation. And this comes from Virginia. Quote, the slaves here are feeling the most intense grief from the effect of the proclamation. Another quoted enslaved people saying, we have fears of evil from the effect of the proclamation. Grief, fears of evil. That's certainly, when I first came across those quotes, that wasn't what I expected to hear. It seems a little bit puzzling. How could something that we revere so much today have been troubling to some of the people most affected by it? And I want to emphasize some. Those quotes don't reflect everybody, but they certainly reflect an important group of people. Well, today I want to unravel that little mystery by turning our attention more fully to the perspective of enslaved people themselves and look at how they viewed the proclamation. It's a perspective that historians have not fully taken very seriously, or at least have glossed over it by talking about the slaves' gratitude to Abraham Lincoln. Their perspective, it turns out, was more complex. And as you may have heard in the quotes, what they referred to was the effect of the proclamation. That's what was troubling. It wasn't the intent of the proclamation, but its effect, the way it would actually work and the way it would actually play out in everyday life. And if we look a little closer, which is something that I do in my book, there's the cover there. If we look a little closer at the way the proclamation worked, the way emancipation actually worked in everyday life, one thing we can see is that it was very deeply embedded in the military conflict. It was deeply entangled in considerations of military strategy, in battles and campaigns, in all the starts and stops that are characteristic of war making. And in fact, this would make emancipation in the United States somewhat distinct from other societies in the Western Hemisphere that were enacting emancipation in the 19th century. With the exception of Haiti and Cuba, in all other places, it was a much more peaceful process. It did not take place in a war. But it takes place in a war in the United States, which is really going to affect the way it plays out day to day. And so it may be a truism to say that in war there is fear and uncertainty and apprehension. Well, in an emancipation process that is facilitated by a war, there's going to be fear and apprehension and uncertainty too. Well, to begin understanding all of this, we first have to turn the clock back to 2 years before the proclamation, with the very beginning of the war itself. So we're talking spring of 1861. By the time the proclamation came down in 63, emancipation had already been in the works for 2 years. So the proclamation itself was not a beginning. In some ways, it's a culmination of what was already going on. And what was going on in the spring of 1861 was from literally the very earliest moments of this war. Enslaved people in all different places in the South were on the move. Pensacola, Florida, Maryland, Virginia. Okay, I fixed that, I think. In a lot of these places, enslaved people were fleeing their farms and plantations and heading to places in the South where there were Union military installations. So they began seeking refuge with the Union Army, and they were doing this, under the cover of the night, secretly. This was not something that anybody around them, any white people around them, were condoning. They sought refuge with the Union, but at this point in the war, in the first month of the war or so, the Union had not enacted any kind of emancipation policy. The Union had not said it was going to help enslaved people exactly, but still these people sought refuge. Why did they do it? Well, the best answer perhaps is provided in the old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that there was some hope that this Union that was fighting their slaveholding owners would perhaps be their friend. Well, what happened initially in the first month of the war is that Union officials in these installations turned back the enslaved people. And they did so not necessarily because they were inhumane, but because they were fighting a war to uphold federal law. And the federal law at the time required people in the Union to turn back any runaway enslaved people and help their owners even get them back. This was written into the Constitution. There's a provision of the Constitution we call the Fugitive Slave Provision that required this. And then later in 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which really helped enforce that constitutional provision and made it really something to be punished for if you did not help runaway slaves get back to their owners. So that was the federal law in this first year of the war. But by the end of May 1861, one federal commander in Virginia began to think a little bit differently about this. And this was Union General Benjamin Butler. You can see pictured here. He was at Fort Monroe in Virginia, which is right along the coast. It's right near Hampton, Virginia, basically right across a creek from Hampton, Virginia. And he had just taken command at Fort Monroe in May 1861, a place where his predecessor had already been turning back enslaved people. But Butler, as I said, began to think differently, and he soon, by the end of May, issued an order that would reverse the federal policy. His order jettisoned the Fugitive Slave Act and instead required his men in the Union Army to admit runaway enslaved people into Union lines and provide them with protection. Protection meaning make sure they are not returned to slavery, but also it meant providing food rations and shelter. He also stipulated that any of the people provided with protection should be employed by the federal army as laborers with the quartermaster's department, or cooks, laundresses, and so forth. So how did Butler do this? How did he decide to go against the tide of federal policy? Well, he explained his move in a letter to the General-in-Chief, Winfield Scott. that, quote, the Fugitive Slave Act did not affect a foreign country, which Virginia claimed to be. And she was taken at her word. He's basically saying, hey, you are withdrawing from the Union, withdrawing from the federal government, well, then our federal laws aren't going to protect you anymore. Makes sense today. Plenty of people at the time, though, were not so sure about Butler's move there. But Butler also argued a couple other things. He said, this makes good military sense. If we allow enslaved people to come into Union lines and work for the Union Army, well, that's taking labor away from the Confederacy and the Confederate war effort, so that hurts the enemy, while helping us. And then he went on further to justify his order legally as another form of property seizure. So this is where it gets a little complicated, too. He argued that the Union could seize enslaved people as, quote-unquote, contraband of war, and that was the phrase he used, contraband. In fact, his order has come to be known as the Contraband Order. So therefore, the Union could seize enslaved people just like they would seize other forms of enemy property. So his order is allowing them to have protection, but still referring to them as property. So should reveal pretty clearly that this was not an order freeing people exactly, but it certainly was a first step on that road. He had set a new precedent for Union policy that would then be adopted throughout the South gradually. The General-in-Chief, Winfield Scott, he approved of what Butler had done, and Abraham Lincoln did as well. So what happened next? Well, I think a few images will best describe it. Tens of thousands of enslaved men, women, and children would begin fleeing in much larger numbers to these Union military posts. Men, women, and children. It's estimated about 500,000 did so over the course of the war, and that works out to be about 1/8 of the enslaved population. So a pretty significant proportion. And they seized this opportunity again. Here's a picture from Harper's Weekly, the New York magazine. And this is dated August 17th, 1861. So that first summer of the war. And depicting large numbers who are making their way over the creek. And over here would be Fortress Monroe. 1/8 of the slave population. What's also notable about that is how many children were fleeing into Union lines as well over the course of the war. It's something that is distinct from slave flight before the war. You know, we know about the Underground Railroad. That's well known in our history. We know about enslaved people who are fleeing to the north and into Canada. But very often children were not part of that because of the great risk that was involved and the uncertainty about whether they would make it into freedom. Well, the fact that there were so many children suggests that many of their parents, their families, thought this is the moment. We are actually going to become free, and now it's time to bring the children. I'm going to talk about some of the places where they went, but in some of the places, children were the majority of the population fleeing. So they fled, and they went into Union Army lines and began setting up encampments. Some officials at the time called them contraband camps. Others preferred the term refugee camp, and it was a term that they used at the time, refugee. They saw them as refugees from slavery. They were refugees from persecution, seeking protection across national lines. And they set up camps in places like Helena, Arkansas, which is right on the western bank of the Mississippi River. Port Royal, South Carolina, the South Carolina Sea Islands, you may be familiar with. Camp Nelson, Kentucky, this is right down the road where I come from, not too far from Lexington. And these are all photographs from the war years. So it gives you an idea of the kind of housing that they were creating for themselves with the assistance of the Army. You can go back here and see sometimes it was simply a tent. Oftentimes these were cast-off soldiers' tents that were not being used anymore, would now be used to house these refugees. Sometimes the housing was newly built by these refugees themselves. They worked just as Benjamin Butler had ordered at Fort Monroe. They worked for the Union Army, again, as hard laborers, also as cooks and laundresses, which that's hard labor too, I should note. And they were promised wages for their labor. And if I had more time, I could go into a lot more detail about that, but they were promised wages from the outset. So even though Butler kind of classified them as property, they were also, though, being treated as free laborers. But the other complicated part of that story is oftentimes those wages weren't forthcoming, even though they were promised, and that would be a source of conflict between some of these refugees and the Union Army throughout the war. Here's pictures of, you could see the laundresses with their tubs working at a Union Army post. Here are other pictures of military laborers as well. And eventually, by 1863, we start to see some of the men enlisting in the Union Army as well into regiments of the United States Colored Troops. In the camps, they didn't just work, and they didn't just recreate or reestablish their family life. They also began establishing independent churches for themselves and teaching themselves to read and write with the help of missionaries, northern missionaries who started coming down from northern states. The Quakers were eventually a pretty big presence in both Virginia and in the Mississippi Valley. There was also an organization, the American Missionary Association, which was a non-denominational group that was also sending these missionaries down and to set up schools, and they were shipping books and slates and pencils and all the kinds of things that were needed for schooling. So they were establishing new lives for themselves. Here's another school. This one is from Camp Nelson, Kentucky. But they also suffered tremendously, because if you know what it was like for soldiers in a soldier's camp, you probably are familiar that illness ran rampant, so did disease. Disease was the great killer of soldiers in the war. Well, these refugee camps were no exception from that. Illness, disease, food shortages, inadequate medical care all ran rampant through them as well. We have no estimates of death rates exactly for these refugees, because there were not those sorts of records were not kept very carefully. But we can certainly extrapolate from the soldiers' experience and guess that these were pretty deadly places as well. All of this running into Union lines and setting up refugee camps happened, again, pretty much everywhere the Union Army went during the first 2 years of the war. And this map here maps places where I've been able to identify where one of these refugee camps stood. And if you're familiar with the history of the Union Army's occupation of the South, you can kind of see that these camps follow that footprint. So again, they follow the Union Army. So along the coast, you can see the Carolinas there, up into Virginia, across the border states, and especially down the Mississippi River Valley. I've counted about 300 total. I don't think that is the full figure. I think there are more to be found. But it still gives you an idea of how widespread this was. And the net result of all of this was arguably the United States' first large-scale refugee crisis. I think we can consider it that. But interestingly, despite how difficult this way of setting up a new life would be, despite the illness and disease, enslaved people kept coming. And they continued to flee into Union lines, even without the assurance of the federal government that they would be free. So this tells you something about how desperate they were to escape slavery, and how hopeful they were that the Union would be on their side, and how that whole experience plays out day to day is really the focus of my book. And what I tried to set out to do is to understand, it was almost really perplexing to me, somebody who's coming out of slavery and establishing a new life in freedom. What is it like to live with a military and live that militarized life in your first years of freedom? What does it mean? So in my book, I set out to follow particular people and to see if I could piece together the stories of particular individuals and follow them through this experience, to really get a sense of the day-to-dayness of it. And so I thought I would share with you today one of the stories that I uncovered involving a married couple. Their names were Edward and Emma Whitehurst, and they were among the first to enter Union Army lines in Virginia in 1861. They had both been enslaved in what is now Newport News, Virginia, and this is on the Virginia Peninsula here, so they were enslaved somewhere here by the point of Newport News. And Emma was a field hand on a plantation there, so she was cultivating all sorts of agricultural products, mostly vegetables, but also wheat as well. Edward, though, was what was known as a hired out slave. So what this meant is he probably had a skill, and I don't know what it was, he may have been a carpenter, he may have been a blacksmith, had some skill that his owner then hired out to other people. And normally how that worked is the owner would hire him out, and then the wages paid by that employer would be sent back to the owner. In some cases, and this was true with Edward Whitehurst's case, if this enslaved person worked extra hours, did what was called overwork, then they might be allowed to save some of those extra wages. And he was. Because by the time the war came, and this was something that surprised me when I first came across this in their story, Edward and Emma Whitehurst were in possession of a trunk which had $500 in gold and silver coin in it. Obviously, they've been saving for a very long time, and saving for something in particular, and the best guess is they were saving to do what many other enslaved people who had some access to wages did, which was to buy their own freedom. So they were clearly gearing up to try to purchase their way out of slavery, but then the war came and kind of changed everything, as wars do. Within weeks of the war's beginning, they began hearing about other enslaved people on Virginia's peninsula who were heading to Fort Monroe. Just to point this out, this is Fort Monroe, where Benjamin Butler was and where the first enslaved people were heading. So the Whitehursts were likely hearing about all of that because many of the first enslaved people here to Fort Monroe were coming from this part of the peninsula. So there's a good chance that they were getting word about what was going on. Well, then what happens is in May 1861, Union forces start leaving Fort Monroe and expanding their presence on the peninsula, including into Newport News. And so at one point, the Whitehursts learned that there was a new Union camp that had just been established 2 miles from their plantation called Camp Butler, named after Benjamin Butler. So they hear about this and they seize the moment on May 27, 1861. They left for Camp Butler and they took up residence there in a new refugee camp. And they had their trunk with them, apparently. They obtained work in the camp hospital, and Edward himself soon became employed as a guide for the Union Army. This was something the Union was very eager to employ enslaved men and sometimes women in this kind of work. They knew the landscape, they knew the terrain, they could help guide troops to where they needed to go. In Edward's case, there was a battle at Big Bethel that summer, right up here, and he helped guide some of the Union troops up to that battle. It was not a success for the Union, but that was not Edward's fault. That's a whole other story. It turned out to be a pretty tumultuous existence for them that summer, their first summer with the Union. In part because the Confederates had not abandoned the region entirely. They were still fighting to get it back. And so there were all sorts of things going on that the Confederates were doing. They were trying to recapture some of the enslaved people who had entered into Union Army lines, so there was a fear of being kidnapped. There was also, after Manassas, which is obviously farther north and west of this part of Virginia, after the first Battle of Manassas, we see a contraction of Union troops from the peninsula back down to Fort Monroe, which meant that Camp Butler had to be evacuated by the Union that summer. Well, I don't have all the details about how the Whitehursts experienced that moment, but I do know that they did escape Camp Butler just after the Confederacy arrived to reclaim it. They went to Fort Monroe. They sought refuge there inside its stone walls. Is that me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stand back. All right. They sought refuge at Fort Monroe and became employed again working in hospitals. But they soon set their sights on a different means of support. And within a few weeks, so now we're talking August 1861, Edward and Emma Whitehurst established in Hampton a store. They set up a store. Now, when I first heard this, I thought, wow, what a thing to do in your first days of freedom. It's not an easy thing to do. I don't know if we have any store owners here, but you have to have a little bit of capital. You've got to have some inventory and so forth. It's not easy logistically to do. Well, it turns out they took their trunk and they opened it up and they used some of that money to purchase all sorts of things, vegetables, flour, potatoes. They purchased it from Army sutlers. There's a reference in a record I saw where Edward indicates that he had made his way to Baltimore that summer. The circumstances of that are a little bit of a mystery to me, but he went to Baltimore. But what he also did was he returned to their plantation, which was a pretty risky thing to do. But he returned and gathered some of the harvest, some of the things they had harvested themselves, to come bring into their store. And so they set up this store, and there they were, within a few months of the war's beginning, a husband and wife who had transformed themselves from enslaved people into independent proprietors. So this is like, talk about the American dream. Okay, there they had it. But, and the Union's military presence had made their movement possible. But this was war. This is kind of what I said at the beginning. Things are, their journeys are not going to be very linear, simple ones. It's going to be complicated. And things could change in war pretty quickly. The circumstances around them can change pretty quickly, and change it did. Fast forward to the next summer. So now we're talking the summer of 1862, when the region would see an influx of soldiers for the Peninsula Campaign. And this was a Union campaign that was going to head up, come down, Union troops on ships to Fort Monroe and the whole area by the peninsula, and they're going to march up the peninsula and try to take Richmond, the Confederate capital, that way. And this was a campaign led by General George McClellan for the Union Army. Well, what happens if you know the history of that campaign? You know it was not successful. The Union failed to take Richmond, which meant that by the end of the summer, all those Union troops come back down the peninsula towards Fort Monroe. They've just been defeated, they're hot, they're hungry, they're demoralized in some cases, and this is going to affect the Whitehursts and their store. On the one hand, you might say, well, this is more customers. And indeed, they did sell to soldiers. That was part of their market. Soldiers were never fully satisfied with their food rations from the Army, and if they could, try to purchase more. Well, the problem was these troops came down the peninsula. They were hungry, they were frustrated, they had no patience, and apparently no respect for the Whitehurst store. And so what happened was, on one early August morning, the Whitehurst witnessed 2 wagons of soldiers who wheeled up to the front of their store. Out the soldiers came into the store, and they began removing bushels of potatoes, barrels of flour, and about 40 pounds of butter. Hurry up and put it in the wagon, is what a sergeant told his troops that day, and that's what Edward Whitehurst overheard. Edward tried to stop them, but he was told by the same sergeant that, quote, you can't do anything, and to, quote, not make any resistance as the soldiers were hungry and would get something to eat. Well, the soldiers cleared out the entire store that day, and the Whitehursts received no payment for their goods. They lost everything, really everything they had saved for all those years. And they were not the only ones losing out in this moment. We are having dreadful times here, wrote a white missionary who was in the region teaching and setting up churches. The soldiers are nothing more than a mob. The colored people are stripped of everything edible. Soldiers took food, but they also took shelter, expelling black refugees from tents and houses. And soon they started taking the people too. as General McClellan, and the local commander now at Fort Monroe, he had replaced Benjamin Butler, his name was General John Dix, they began ordering the impressment of black men to go to Washington to serve McClellan's retreating troops. Impressment, so forcing these men to work for the Union Army. They're not relying on them to voluntarily say they want to work. They're forcing them in and forcing them to go to Washington, which for some of these refugees is a pretty daunting, scary prospect. Not only do they not know where they're going, but they want to stay with their families. They want to stay with the people they know and not be separated again. So August 1862 proved to be a pretty low point for this population. As one refugee remarked, quote, "Good God, if this is the way we are to be treated, we may just as well be in slavery." Well, I tell you that story in part, and there's more to the story, but to suggest that then, again, this is August 1862, the timing of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and particularly his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, he issues a first draft first, which was made public the next month in September 1862, was pretty good timing from the perspective of these refugees from slavery, people like Edward and Emma Whitehurst. And what happens is here, just right here on the tip of the peninsula, we start hearing celebrations when this preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is announced. "We have rejoiced with you in the proclamation of the President," was how a missionary in Hampton described the local reaction. "The people here seem to rejoice with joy unspeakable at the prospect of freedom at New Year's." What the word of this preliminary proclamation did to this population that's suddenly, being robbed by the Union Army, it made clear for the first time that the Union did intend to make sure they were legally free and that the Union would support and fight for legal freedom. It provided the assurance that, yes, their time in Union lines, no matter how difficult, was not in vain and would lead to freedom. That through these refugee camps now stretched a road towards freedom and citizenship. And so they celebrated. November 1862, refugee people in Hampton, Virginia, held a public meeting specifically to plan how they would observe that momentous day of January 1st, 1863, when the proclamation went into effect. And they themselves actually issued a proclamation that day listing how they wanted to celebrate when the proclamation came down. And they set aside January 1st as a day of Thanksgiving. They said they would spend the day with 12-hour worship sessions. They pledged not to work and to close their businesses for the day. And they pledged to pray together, quote, "for deliverance from the yoke of bondage." And one thing I have to know, when I first saw that and they said they pledged to close their businesses for the day, I realized, wow, the Whitehurst weren't the only ones. That setting up small markets and businesses was a not uncommon way for some of these newly, or somebody recently out of slavery to make a living. So spirits were high. But then December 1862 came, the next month. And in that month, President Lincoln announced that he had exempted certain regions from the Emancipation Proclamation. And among them, let me go back here. Among them was a 6-county region around Fort Monroe. And I've just kind of excerpted here where he does this. He's saying in the beginning of this excerpt that this proclamation applies to South Carolina, to North Carolina, to Virginia, so these rebelling Confederate states. But after Virginia says, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also the counties of Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth. Well, Fort Monroe and Hampton were in Elizabeth City County. So they had just been exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation, which meant Edward and Emma Whitehurst were living in a region exempt from the proclamation, and all the others who had been seeking refuge there from the first month of the war, they would be exempt. And in fact, this is a map. So this is the map I showed you before with the sites of these camps, and shows you how many, and I've counted really about a third of these refugee camps were in areas exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. You can see here the darker gray up here. Those were exempted border states, because what Lincoln was thinking here is, the proclamation he justified legally as a military necessity. This is how constitutionally, as commander-in-chief, he was able to reverse that federal law, federal policy, like Butler had done, and how he felt he had the constitutional power as commander-in-chief to do this. If it was a military necessity, it was therefore a constitutional act. And so, but he recognized that it was only a military necessity to free enslaved people in places that were still in rebellion against the Union. So slaveholding regions that were not still in rebellion, that were Union areas, would be exempt. There was no military necessity. So those border states, Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, exempt for that reason. Then there are other parts of the South that the Union had taken back or had occupied. That were now not currently in rebellion against the Union. Tennessee, you can see right there, was one of those areas. And then these two areas in the boxes around New Orleans and also along the coast of Virginia. And I'll just do a blow-up of the coast of Virginia right here. You can see this dark area. These were exempt, and there are all these refugee camps in there. So, now, I will note there was kind of an interesting sort of side story on, if you know much about Union occupation, there were other places that the Union occupied at this time that were not exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. Here along the coast, the South Carolina Sea Islands, there was one example. But one thing Lincoln had done is he said, well, to determine which of these occupied areas were now officially loyal to the Union, those areas had to hold a special congressional election, and they had to elect a member of Congress to represent them who would now go to Washington. And therefore, we could see this as truly a loyal place, and it would be exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, what happened in Virginia were some white slaveholders who said they were loyal to the Union, pledged to be loyal to the Union. They got together and they held a quickie election in December 1862, and they quickly elected one of themselves as a member of Congress, and that's how they got this region exempt. Some historians like Eric Foner, some of you may be familiar with his work on Reconstruction, have called this an unseemly scramble for exemptions here in late 1862. There were other critics. A newspaper in London, England, the London Spectator, suggested that there was something very shallow in what the United States was doing, and said the principle is not that a human being cannot justly own another, but that he cannot own him unless he is loyal to the United States. So that came that fall. So the U.S. was indeed unique in the world in making a slave owner's political loyalty a determinant of a slave's entitlement to freedom, but it was war. This is war, the war context, and in war, loyalty is everything. So, in this process of securing exemptions, this is where things get confusing for people on the ground who are seeking freedom. What does this mean to them in practice, in its effects? So this takes us back to those first quotes I read to you at the beginning, when there's this fear of the effect of the proclamation. And what they fear here in Virginia is, well, wait a second. Does this mean the Army's going to stop admitting more people into their lines? Are they going to expel those who had already arrived? What does it mean to be a refugee in an exempt region? So that's where all those fears arose. And they feared that the proclamation was actually going to hurt them rather than help. And the thing about the proclamation is that it really concluded very little in the way of exact instructions. No set of corresponding military orders to guide its implementation. So that's why there's just a lot of confusion and fears. It wasn't spelled out how things would play out. So how would it work? Well, the fears were real. A missionary in the region declared that those, quote, practically freed over the war's first 2 years now seemed in danger of being re-enslaved. And he was right to some degree. Into this murky situation in late 1862, some local slave owners did come into the fort. They started showing up and they started forcibly returning or forcing men, women, and children to return to their plantations, saying, the federal government's not going to free you, you've got to come back. And some Union authorities, some of them who were unsympathetic to start with, others who were simply confused by this whole situation, sometimes complied and helped the slave owners. It remained a problem 7 months later after the proclamation, August 1863, prompting one local army official there to stress, quote, the importance, if possible, of getting the exemption clause of the president's proclamation removed. It is a terrible clog and drawback upon our success, he concluded, noting how the Secesh take advantage of it to carry on their schemes of kidnapping and plundering the Negroes. Well, they never got the exemption removed. I'm going to fast forward a little bit here. But the passage of time can sometimes be clarifying. And soon all this confusion gave way to a little more clarity about what was going to happen. And over the next year or so, what became increasingly clear is that although some of these former slaves here in the exempt regions were kidnapped, the vast majority were not. And over time, the army got behind them and protected the rest from being kidnapped. Why did they do it? Well, it became clear that the proclamation, kind of came in midstream in the war, and came in midstream when there had already been policies like Benjamin Butler's already in effect. And I didn't even tell you about all the other ones that followed Butler's. But Congress, in the first summer of the war, took Butler's order and made it federal policy everywhere. So by the logic of Butler's original order, the Union could still protect these people. There was also an obscure article of war passed by Congress in March 1862 that prohibited military personnel from returning fugitives to their owners, refugees, on penalty of being dismissed from the service. So you could be court-martialed and dismissed if you returned enslaved people to their owners. So that business of kidnapping was stopped in part by people recognizing this article of war applied. So what happened was basically the momentum of these existing policies continued. And what it meant was that things were not going to change here at Fort Monroe and Hampton. And that, in fact, the effect of the proclamation that they feared was really, there wasn't much of an effect. It wasn't going to change things. It wasn't going to transform things, which is kind of ironic. We think about the great hope that the proclamation was going to change things. But in fact, it was going to do the reverse here, or it wasn't going to do anything. And that was a point to celebrate. So this all points, getting back to the bigger picture here, to the meaning and purpose of these refugee camps themselves. What it meant for the rest of the war is that one simply had to get oneself physically located in one of these spaces. And if one did that, they would be assured of federal protection, and then eventual freedom would follow. So the camps anchored a person physically in the hope and promise of freedom. And so over time, they became sites of celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation. Former slaves at or near Fort Monroe, despite being exempted, began holding anniversary celebrations of the proclamation beginning in January 1864, the one-year anniversary. They held parades that featured regiments of black troops. They had public programs with Union officers as guest speakers. They had music concerts. In 1866, which was the third celebration, an estimated 4,000 people showed up for their celebration. These became known as Emancipation Days and would continue well into the post-war period, not just in Virginia, but throughout the South. And they've never become a national holiday. Sometimes that does come up, and it still comes up as possible. This should be a national holiday. But they celebrated back then because they knew that the one thing the proclamation did give them was a commitment by the federal government that a Union victory would bring freedom. So all the kind of uncertainty they had, they knew they had protection, but would they have eventual legal freedom? The proclamation helped clear that up. Frederick Douglass, the well-known abolitionist, called one such event, an Emancipation Day event in Boston, quote, a worthy celebration of the first step on the part of the nation in its departure from the thraldom of the ages. And I think his point about the first step, the proclamation was a first step. I would call it actually maybe a third or fourth step, but still, it was an early step. And we could say that about these refugee camps themselves. These were quite literally spaces that were a first step. There's a much longer history of them. I'll just sort of give you a preview in that a lot of these refugee camps did not last the end of the war. But it was a first step to get oneself in a place to be protected, to then begin to have the hope of freedom in the long term. So I will leave it there, but I know we have some time for questions, and I'm happy to fill out more of the story or answer any questions you might have.